Welcome to episode 6 of the Lost Lessons of Money series, where we cover the topic of America's first crash, 1792, in focus.
Before the Great Depression, before the Panic of 1907, before the Federal Reserve existed, America had its first financial crash. It was 1792, a nation barely born, and its markets collapsed before its constitution could stand. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to the Finance Arcana YouTube channel. And we are in the 1790s, and the new republic is struggling to prove its credit to a skeptical world. The price of liberty had been steep. The Revolutionary War left behind a mountain of debt, a chaotic mess of IOUs issued by the Continental Congress and the individual states. This war debt hung like a chain around the young government's neck. To foreign powers in London and Amsterdam, America looked like a bad loan, unreliable and likely to default. Its paper money was nearly worthless. The nation's very survival depended on solving this crisis of confidence. It was a plan of breathtaking scope. Visionary because it would transform the nation's weakness into its greatest strength, binding the wealthy class to the success of the new government. But it was also profoundly dangerous. To his critics, like Thomas Jefferson, it was a betrayal of the revolution's ideals, a scheme to centralize power and enrich a select few urban financiers at the expense of the agrarian majority. To make America credible abroad, Hamilton needed speculators at home. He knew that for his plan to work, the nation's debt had to be seen as a reliable investment. He needed more than just passive belief. He needed an active, thriving market. He needed risk-takers who would trade the government's promises, betting on the future of the United States itself. But where there's paper and credit, there's leverage. Why buy one bond with your own money when you could borrow and buy 10? This amplification of buying power could create fortunes in weeks, but it also created a hidden architecture of interconnected risk. A single default could trigger a cascade, bringing the entire system crashing down. Hamilton's grand design rested on a fragile foundation of confidence. And that confidence was about to be tested by one of his oldest friends. Speculation spread like a fever through the city's veins. The engine of this frenzy was Alexander Hamilton's grand financial plan. By assuming the state's Revolutionary War debts, the federal government had created a vast new market for its securities. These weren't just pieces of paper, they were promises backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. To a young nation eager to prove its worth, they were irresistible. And so, government securities soared. Their value climbed day by day, not on the basis of any tangible output, but on the sheer intoxicating belief that they would be worth more tomorrow. This belief created a powerful feedback loop. As prices rose, more people wanted in. The demand pushed prices higher still. It was a staircase to the heavens, and no one could imagine it leading anywhere else. To climb this staircase, speculators needed capital, and the fledgling banking system was more than happy to provide it. Banks issued easy loans to finance trades, often accepting the very securities being purchased as collateral. This is the magic and the menace of leverage. With a small down payment, a speculator could control a position many times its size. If the market went up, their profits were magnified. But it was a double-edged sword, a fact few paused to consider. Soon, men with no experience in finance became millionaires on paper. Shopkeepers, artisans, lawyers, men who had previously dealt in shillings and pence were now calculating fortunes in the thousands. They bought finer clothes, grander houses, and carried themselves with the unshakable confidence of those who believe they have discovered a secret path to wealth. The old aristocracy of land and title looked on with a mixture of envy and disdain. A new power was rising, one based not on birthright, but on nerve and access to credit. At the very center of this swirling vortex of ambition and greed was a single, brilliant, and fatally flawed man, William Dewar. He was no common speculator. A signatory of the Articles of Confederation and a titan of New York society, he was the former Assistant Treasury Secretary, Hamilton's own right-hand man. Now a private citizen, he was perfectly positioned to exploit the very system he had helped create. Dewar didn't just participate in the market, he sought to command it. He formed a syndicate, a secret pool of wealthy investors who entrusted their capital to his judgment. Their goal was audacious: to corner the market on government debt, driving prices to stratospheric levels before selling out and leaving others to deal with the collapse. He was playing a game no one else even knew existed, and he had a trump card. He used his intimate inside knowledge of Hamilton's policies to leverage millions in credit. Dewar knew the Treasury's secrets. He knew when Hamilton's agent, the Bank of New York, would intervene to purchase government bonds to stabilize their price. This knowledge provided him with a safety net. He could bet big, knowing the government would effectively backstop his positions if the market turned against him. It was a sure thing. When a friend, marveling at the scale of his operations, asked how he could possibly lose, Dewar smiled, the candlelight glinting in his eyes. His reply was a simple, devastating boast, an admission of a crime that didn't even have a name yet. From his office, Alexander Hamilton watched the speculative mania with growing unease. He had designed his system to build national credit and foster economic stability, not to fuel a gambling addiction. He saw the rising prices and heard the rumors of fantastic wealth, but he didn't realize the extent of the corruption. He didn't realize his own financial system, his great engine of prosperity, had created a monster, and he certainly didn't suspect that the monster was being driven by his former confidant. The stage was set, the players had all made their bets, but the foundation of this paper metropolis was built on nothing more than borrowed money and a secret advantage. The nation's first insider trading scandal was already underway, ticking like a bomb beneath the streets of New York. The crash was not a matter of if, but when. The coffeehouses of Wall Street were arenas of financial combat, where men like William Dewar, the king of the speculators, held court. His every move was watched. His every whisper of a stock tip was gospel. The nation's new financial system, the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, seemed to be working, perhaps too well. The engine of credit was running white-hot, but engines that run too hot are prone to seizing. The turning point came with brutal swiftness. On the 9th of March, a day that would live in infamy in the young republic's financial history, William Dewar took a fateful step. Overextended and unable to secure fresh loans, he stopped making payments on his vast network of personal notes. It was a quiet act, a private failure, but in the interconnected web of Wall Street credit, it was the equivalent of cutting the master cable of a suspension bridge. The tremors began almost immediately. Word of Dewar's default spread not like a fire, but like a frost. Credit, the lifeblood of the market, began to freeze solid. Lenders who had freely offered money just days before now saw risk in every shadow. They began calling in their loans, demanding immediate repayment from everyone. The Bank of New York, the very institution Hamilton had championed, was the first to tighten the screws. Its directors, many of whom were Dewar's rivals and victims, voted to restrict credit dramatically, a lifeline for some, a noose for many others. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Interest rates, the price of money itself, didn't just rise, they exploded. The official discount rate, a stable 6% for months, became a historical footnote. On the street, desperate brokers were forced to pay annualized rates of over 30%, then 50%, some even paying a ruinous 1% per day. It was financial strangulation in real time. Money had simply vanished. Panic gripped Wall Street. The confident swagger of the speculators evaporated, replaced by the wild-eyed fear of the ruined. Brokers who had leveraged themselves to the hilt, using borrowed money to buy stocks on the assumption prices would only go up, were now trapped. They scrambled to cover their positions, trying to sell assets into a market where there were no buyers. Ledgers were slammed open. Men shouted themselves hoarse in the street. Couriers ran through the muddy lanes with notices of default. The machine that had printed wealth was now a meat grinder. At the center of this vortex was William Dewar. His personal empire, built on a pyramid of debt and insider knowledge, didn't just unravel, it disintegrated. The man who had once been Assistant Secretary of the Treasury alongside Hamilton was now a financial pariah. His debts were staggering. He owed an estimated $3 million, a sum so vast it was difficult to comprehend. To put it in perspective, it was more than the entire annual budget of the United States government. He owed money to everyone, powerful bankers, wealthy merchants, but also to shopkeepers, artisans, and widows who had entrusted him with their life savings. As Dewar's failure cascaded through the system, the banks themselves began to teeter. The Bank of New York and the newly chartered Bank of the United States saw their capital reserves drain away as panicked depositors rushed to withdraw their money. The fear was that the banks held too much of the now worthless paper from Dewar and other failed speculators. Credit froze completely. No one would lend to anyone. Commerce in the nation's largest city ground to a halt. The panic was no longer confined to Wall Street. It had infected the entire economy. And with that economic fear came rage. The public's adulation for the financial wizards turned to furious resentment. Crowds of merchants, laborers, and ruined investors gathered, their mood growing uglier by the hour. They didn't just riot outside financial offices, they marched on William Dewar's home, their shouts for his ruin echoing through the night. These were the very people who had once cheered the rising market, who had believed in the dream of easy wealth. Now their dreams were ashes, and they wanted someone to blame. In Philadelphia, the nation's capital, Alexander Hamilton watched the disaster unfold through a series of frantic letters. His entire financial architecture, the foundation of America's economic future, was on the brink of collapse. He had to act, but how? A direct bailout of Dewar was politically impossible. It would look like cronyism. Yet inaction meant certain doom. The pressure was immense. Then, a private letter from a trusted ally in New York arrived. Its contents so stark, so desperate, it left Hamilton no choice. He had to intervene, and he had to do it now. Hamilton's response was swift, decisive, and utterly unprecedented. He convened the commissioners of the sinking fund and authorized them to do something radical: use federal money to buy government securities on the open market. He also secretly instructed the Bank of New York to continue lending, promising that the U.S. Treasury would buy up to $500,000 of the debt as collateral. It was the nation's first ever bailout. In private letters, his justification was clear and fierce. He wrote, "I consider the credit of the United States as a national asset, to be defended like territory." This wasn't about saving his friends, it was about saving the nation's reputation. Within weeks, the injection of liquidity worked. The relentless selling pressure eased, and confidence, fragile at first, began to seep back into the market. The panic was broken, the streets grew quiet again, but the landscape was forever changed. William Dewar, the architect of the boom and the catalyst for the bust, was ruined. On March 23rd, he was arrested for his debts and thrown into debtor's prison. The king was dethroned, and his fall served as a brutal lesson for the new nation. The first great American financial crash was over, but its echoes would reverberate for centuries. The crash revealed two truths that would define American finance forever. First, credit is power. Whoever controls liquidity controls the nation. Second, moral hazard is immortal. Even in a republic built on virtue, speculators would always test its limits. But the real lesson came quietly. Hamilton had saved the market, but he also taught future governments that markets could be saved. The precedent for bailouts was born in 1792. Two centuries later, the pattern remains. Markets rise on credit, they fall on fear, and each time the government steps in to save the system. Hamilton's playbook became the Fed's mandate. From the panic of 1907 to the Great Recession to the COVID-19 rescue, the logic never changed. Every crisis asks the same question: are we saving the market or merely delaying the reckoning? The crash of 1792 was America's first lesson in financial hubris, a reminder that innovation without discipline always ends in panic. Hamilton understood credit, but he also understood fear, and every investor since has tried to balance the two. History doesn't repeat, it re-leverages. If this story resonated, please like, share, and subscribe to the Finance Arcana YouTube channel. Thank you for watching America's First Crash, 1792 in Focus. Stay tuned to our other upcoming episodes of the Lost Lessons of Money series.